Well, welcome to question 54 of the secundae. The topic for this lecture is negligence, and I am Dr. Thibault. So when we're placing negligence, we're looking at negligence under the cardinal virtue of prudence. Now we've already looked at prudence in itself, the parts of prudence, the corresponding gift of prudence, and now we are looking at the vices. Um, the vices are, there's three short sections on the vices. The first being imprudence, which is stated quite obviously in opposition to prudence. The opposite vice to prudence being imprudence, quite obvious. Um, and now we're looking at negligence, which is against solicitude, which is part of shrewdness. So this is against a very narrow part. So imprudence kind of against all of prudence and negligence against a particular part. And then we'll go into the things that look like prudence but are actually imprudent. Those would be false, kind of fraud prudence, and the precepts of prudence. So this section, to be honest, is a little bit more complicated than other sections. More complicated than imprudence for sure. And it's not because the language is so difficult. It's not because it's long. It's only 3 articles long. But the questions that are asked uh, are fine questions, but they might not be the questions that you would be asking, and they're not necessarily questions that lead us into a more thorough understanding of prudence itself. So it seems like there might be a context to negligence here that is not quite obvious. And I wish I had the answer of how this piece fits into the puzzle and has it all make sense and is much more, straightforward. But unfortunately, I don't have that answer. If anybody does, that would be really interesting. Put it in the comments. And if anybody's uh, looking at this for some type of guidance in terms of uh, looking at this in class, maybe if you're a student preparing for class and you're watching this, this would be an interesting question perhaps to bring up, which would be how really does negligence play into the totality of the question of prudence? Maybe your professor or some of your classmates might have some other insights. Perhaps I will later on, but at this point, I don't have a great deal of insight. So the first question is negligence a special sin? So this is not a question which directly, again, ties it into prudence, in a direct way. And the answer is yes, because almost every time the question is asked, is it a special sin? It is almost always a special sin. Well, how is it a special sin? Well, special sins often are vices associated with a special virtue. That's the most obvious way that something is a special sin. So negligence denotes a lack of solicitude. Solicitude might sound familiar. It's a kind of care. Uh, but if you recall back to question 47 of the secundae, just just a few questions ago, when we introduced this whole topic of prudence, Article 9 dealt with the issue of solicitude. And how was solicitude dealt with? Um, well, St. Thomas used the definition from Isidore of Seville, which said a man is said to be solicitous through being shrewd and alert. So now shrewdness we've gone into with much more detail. So now we have some of the language of why are we talking about this? Well, this is negligence is a special sin against solicitude, which in some sense is shrewdness. Now, if you recall, when we dealt with the potential parts of when we dealt with the parts of the integral parts of uh, prudence, we dealt with memory, uh, and we also dealt with understanding, memory of the past, understanding of the present. And we also talked about, well, how do you get this knowledge? Well, you can get it through docility, which would be learning from others. And then there was shrewdness, which was from your own experience, right? So here we were dealing with experience. So have you learned from your experience? Do you have insights into good counsel? Uh, do you have insights into this good counsel on how you should act in terms of your actions? So this would be saying you are not learning good counsel from your actions. So negligence would be experiencing something and then not uh, not gaining wisdom from it, not gaining practical understanding from it. This is a person who goes through life and they keep on falling into the same hole over and over again, right? We aim to well, we are people who keep making mistakes, but we hope to make different mistakes each time, not the same mistake. Somebody who's dealing with negligence is dealing with the same mistake over and over again because they are not learning from their experience, which they would have gained through shrewdness or solicitude. So this is how it ties in. Now, solicitude is a special virtue. Um, Again, so negligence is a special. So that's the answer is negligence a special sin? In some ways, is an easy one, but it also helps to try to tie it into the prudence more. How is negligence opposed to prudence? Um, well, all 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 sins are in some sense opposed to prudence because prudence is the right ordering of actions so that they produce the greatest outcome. So if it leads to sin, then therefore, in a general sense, it's always opposed to prudence. But negligence is also a special sin, so it is especially opposed to prudence. Uh, because negligence is directly opposed to solicitude, which is an integral part. Since shrewdness is an integral part of prudence, makes solicitude right, like an integral part of prudence. Therefore, if you oppose shrewdness, if you oppose solicitude, you are opposing prudence because it's like you can't be against against roofs and be for houses because houses have roofs. So being against an integral part can't be against. If you're against an integral part, you're against the whole. In some sense. Um, Now, solicitude pertains to reason, which makes sense uh, because if you have experienced something, you should internalize it with your intellectual capacities and are able to integrate it into your decision making process and through reason come up with better uh, actions moving forward. That kind of makes sense. So if one so negligence, since it opposes solicitude, it opposes reason. Because shrewdness would lead us to be reasonable, right? Somebody, if you lend somebody $5 and they take it and they don't pay you back, and then next tomorrow they ask for $5, you give it and they don't give it back after the fifth time, right? You should know that they're not going to pay it back. Right? Shrewdness would determine that. If you still are think that they're going to pay you back, uh, you're kind of negligent in your reasoning. Um, Maybe you still give it anyway, right? Giving open-handed to the poor, but that's not. You're at least aware that they're not going to pay it back. Um, Now, a negligent man is one who fails to choose, which is another interesting definition. And it's coming right from the word itself. So negligence, nec, Negligence is failure to choose. Prudence is about right choice, right, making the right choice, following good counsel. Um, so negligence is by kind of by definition of this word, by the etymology of this word, failure of choosing right, failure of choosing to have right counsel. Now there is part of it that is again a little bit confusing. Sometimes when St. Thomas writes a lot, it can get confusing. Sometimes he writes on a topic so little that it kind of makes me say, "Can you say a little bit more?" Because I still don't quite get it. And this part falls kind of under this latter point of saying, "I wish you could say a bit more." Um, so, how is negligent not the same as inconstancy uh, or inconsistency, as I frequently write? Um, uh, Well, an inconstant person is one who fails at commanding, right? We just covered this in under the topic of imprudence in question 53. So this, if you're not aware of this, go back to that video. But it fails to command. Um, Something hinders the ability to command something. So could be some internal or external thing, but there's something which hinders it. Whereas negligence is very similar, right? You're not acting, right? That's the part of the problem is not acting in negligence, but it's even more fundamental in some ways because negligence fails to enact a prompt will. Um, so it's a failure of the will. It's not that one has attempted it and failed, um, but one has not even prompted the will to act. Um, again, I wish there was a bit more to be said about that to flesh that out a bit more, but you can see that there is a connection between the two, but there's also a distinction, and I wish I could clear up the distinction a bit more. But Thomas doesn't really give more explanation of the distinction, because inconstancy is part of prudence, but negligence has its own art of it, its own question. Okay, well, the next question then, and the final question is negligence. Can it be a mortal sin? So, starts all three of these a little bit with a bit of a definition. So, negligence arises out of a certain remissness of the will. Well, what's remissness? Remittere is a faintness, a weakness of will. So, there's a softness to the will. Um, so it's coming from the intellect and the will. So it's coming. Prudence is an act, intellectual virtue, but the intellect has to move the will, right? If this is about an action, the intellect has to guide the will. Now, there's a disconnect here with negligence. There's a disconnect between the intellect and the will. So, intellect uh, is all about it. It's all about this action, but there is not an action of the will to obtain it. So this is uh, again this part. This is we set this up as directly contrary to shrewdness, which is in some sense some level of understanding, right? If you're learning from your experience. So in some ways, it's an understanding of some way, practical reasoning. Um, but here, we're now talking about the will, um, and the examples now are a little bit different as well. So something can be a mortal sin in two ways in regards to negligence. So if something is omitted which is necessary for salvation, um, so if one is perhaps where there's no um, examples given, and so I try to come up with examples, but I'm um, not 100% sure all the time, right? So um, if we were to consider baptism, for example, if a person believes but has not made the steps to be baptized, so there's remissness of the will. So you know how if you're an adult and you weren't baptized as a child, um, you know you have to go to the church. You know you have to inquire with the secretary or the priest. You know you have to begin an RCIA program. You have to do something. It's not, you can't just Google it and find out. You have to now have an act of the will to go about getting baptized. And this is something necessary for salvation, in a sense. Right? Could a non-baptized person be saved? Well, Vatican II says yes, right? So and the church says yes, a person could be saved without baptism. However, the reason you are not baptized is because um, you just haven't put the effort in. Well, that's different, right? It's different if you're a part of the world where Christianity has not yet been preached and you didn't have the opportunity. Here, let's say you're from the United States, Catholic Church down the street, and technically you can even be baptized by anyone in case of an emergency. Right? So, there's no excuse why a person would not be baptized if they believed and wanted to and they were aware of what baptism was. Maybe they've read up on it, but they haven't acted. They've omitted something necessary for salvation because of a lack of will. Well, that would be a mortal sin. Right? You should act. Reason would tell you to act, therefore you should act. The other way, now this is where the example, I think that example is clear, but this example could be similar, right? To be remiss about divine things as to fall away altogether from charity, from the charity of God. Um, Also, you could say baptism, right? um, but perhaps in this example, in this situation, a person um, were already baptized, but they become remiss, right? They become weak-willed of divine things. So maybe going to mass, going to confession, praying, volunteering at the food pantry, um, doing the types of things that a saved person would do, right? A good person, a good Christian person would do. Now, you could fall away from the charity of God altogether because if you were living the right way, you would be going to church at least on Sunday, if not daily mass. You should be praying your rosary or your Divine Mercy chaplet, doing your devotionals, going to confession. There's things you should be doing. Um, if you're not, then you're being remiss. Right? Being remiss of having weak will, a weak will to do it. If the thing that stops you from doing it is you still feel it, just I want to be careful not to move into inconstancy where you would say something has hindered you from doing it, like sleep or job or something else. But in this way, you just have neglected it entirely. It's not even that something has hindered it. You've just omitted it, right? You just haven't done it, right? You were just sitting there watching YouTube videos, and there was no reason why you're not. It's just you're not, right? There just has been a weakness of will to do that. Nothing's hindering you. You're just not trying. That would also then lead to mortal sin, since it's the neglect of divine things. Um, Now, it can be a venial sin if the thing that is neglected uh, is some lack of fervor on matters not necessary for salvation, and they may be a venial sin. So an example of this could be not volunteering at your local food pantry. Parishes have a food pantry. Now, if you're at work or there's a reason for not going, that's one thing. But if you just say, no, I'm just going to stay at home and watch TV, when you could be doing something good like going to the food pantry, that could be sinful in a venial way, right? Because volunteering at the food pantry is not necessary for salvation. Um, but if you had fervor for your faith, if you had fervor for love, for charity, for love of God and love of neighbor, you would go, right? If you if you were really devoted, right, the love of your neighbor would say, yeah, you should serve your neighbor. So therefore, in some sense, it's sinful. Right? There's some level of sinfulness in there, but it's only venial because it's not missing mass, which is obligatory. Um, it's missing the volunteering at the food pantry, which is not obligatory, but it still would be better than what you are currently doing, which would be watching TV or something like that. Um, I have to be careful here because you could say, well, how about praying the rosary? That's another thing. Well, perhaps, but it's really not a sin not to do something you're not required to do. Right? Nobody is required to pray the rosary, therefore, not praying the rosary isn't a sin. If I normally pray a rosary a day and I forget to pray the rosary one day, it's not actually a sin. Um, Even if I don't have a good reason for not doing it, it's not necessarily a sin because I don't. Now, not necessarily obligated to do it. You know, you could look at it through one lens of saying it's it could in some ways be a venial sin. Perhaps if you say every day I pray a rosary for women contemplating abortion. Right? That would be probably a popular thing for a lot of people who pray the rosary to do. To pray for women contemplating abortion or something like that. Well, if that's what you're doing out of love of for your neighbor is praying for them, and now you're not praying for them, there is in some sense a lack of charity to a degree. So therefore, it could be a venial sin. But it depends really how you frame it. Um, And the response to objection one, I gave it its own slide, although it's still part of Article 3. In some ways, a negligence is loving God less. And I thought this was a significant enough spiritual point to have its own section. Um, whether or not negligence is a special sin or not, it probably isn't that useful. It isn't that interesting to most people, but is negligence loving God less? Well, that is kind of interesting. Um, and it can happen in two ways. One is through a lack of fervor of charity, as I just explained. If you're not going to the food pantry when you could, right? If you're not helping out, loving your neighbor when you could, then it could be a venial sin. Um, the second point is the one why I really put it in there was when one lacks charity itself. And this is when one loves God less, or only by mere natural love. And this one brings to mind is within the Stations of the Cross, right? The women of Jerusalem who are weeping for Christ as he's on his uh, way of sorrows. And what's Jesus' response to the women weeping over him? Weep not for me, but for your children and your children's children, because their sadness over what was going on was mere natural love. They didn't want to see another human person suffering. It wasn't that they said, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of God. You are the way, the truth, and the life. You are, you know, remember me when you come into your kingdom." No, it was just crying because a man is suffering. Well, in some ways it's not bad because the love of neighbor does require that, but those are natural love, right? The highest forms of natural love is between a mother and to a child, right? So if Mary's mother only was crying for him because he was her son, that would be natural love. Nothing wrong with that. But uh, Mary's so significant because it wasn't just natural love she had for him. Uh, it was both the love of a mother to a child, but also a recognition of who he was. And we get this from the first miracle of Cana, where she says to them, "Do whatever he tells you." Right? This is not a natural love, but a trust in him as the Son of God. That this is throughout her life. Trust is something greater than just the mother to a child, although the natural love is still there. So, if somebody just sees, well, this can be a challenge to even people who are somewhat devout. If you have fallen in love with the Christ on the crucifix of your church, the image of Christ on the crucifix in your church, and he's so handsome, right? Or he has such a nice smile, or something in his eyes. Well, that might be a wonderful um, product of a great artist to be a great compliment to an artist. But if your affection is only the natural kind, then it is actually loving God less than what is due to him. Therefore, there is in some sense a negligence there, where properly speaking, one should love him for his uh, divine personhood. Um, Divine being would be the humanity's good, right? I'm trying not to fall into heresy here, right? His 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 human personhood and his divine personhood are both important, but if you're only in love with his human personhood, you've missed the point. And the point is that he has a divine being, and that would be true love. That would be loving for him for who he truly is. So, in conclusion, negligence is a special sin because uh, it opposes solicitude, which is part of prudence, an integral part of prudence. It's called shrewdness. Negligence is opposed to prudence because it opposes solicitude, which is an integral part of uh, prudence. And negligence can be a mortal sin if it neglects that which is necessary for salvation, or if it treats God less than he is. So negligence in multiple ways. But negligence could also just be a lack of fervor for things that are not necessary for salvation and therefore a venial sin. So that's what we have on negligence. The next will be these kind of fraudulent copycats of prudence, which are not prudence. That hopefully will be a bit more clear.